Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the very first of our new lunchtime seminar series looking at material histories. I'm Margaret Anderson from the Old Treasury Building, and I'm absolutely delighted that you've been able to join us today. Let me begin by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you from the unceded land of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation. I thank them for their care of culture and of country and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. But I'd also like to acknowledge any First Nations people who may be joining us from elsewhere today. Now, Material Histories is a seminar series offered jointly by the Old Treasury Building and the Australian Catholic University. In each event, we'll aim to explore one aspect of material history through an object or a series of objects. The seminars are open to anybody interested in material history, and over time we aim to cast the subject net widely in terms of both time and place. So if you're interested in contributing, please do get in touch. We'll pop some email addresses on the screen at the end of the seminar. Now, just a few words about the structure of the seminar before I hand over to our chair. I'm sure you're all used to digital seminars by now, but just to confirm that this is using a webinar format, and so only the speakers and their slides will be visible on your screen. Your video and audio are both switched off. If you have any technical difficulties, please use the chat button at the bottom of your screens, and Katie behind the scenes will do her very best to help you. If you have a question, and we do hope you will, please use the Q&A button. And of course, please keep your questions and any comments courteous. And finally, just to reiterate that the webinar is being recorded. And now it is my very great pleasure to introduce the co-convener of Material Histories, Lorinda Kramer, who will chair the discussion today. Dr. Lorinda Kramer is a research fellow in the Gender and Women's History Research Centre in the Institute for Humanities and Social Sciences at ACU. She has a specialist interest in gender, dress and textiles, and in 2020 published her first wonderful book, Needlework and Women's Identity in Colonial Australia. Lorinda, over to you.
Thank you, Margaret. Please let me join Margaret in welcoming you all today to our first Material History seminar. I am so pleased to be introducing you to our two wonderful presenters, Dr. Moya McFadden and Dr. Mary Thompson, who will both be talking about their work with refugee objects. So I'd like to first introduce Dr. Moya McFadden, Senior Curator of Migration and Cultural Diversity at Museums Victoria. Her curatorial work develops collections and exhibitions which consider Australian migration, refugee and asylum seeker narratives, and themes of identity, belonging and diversity. She's interested in the role of museums as sites of social activism and their potential for developing relationships of genuine engagement and reciprocity with communities. Moya's paper is titled Crafting Absence, How Art Gives Voice to Absent Stories. So welcome, Moya.
Thanks, Lorinda. I hope everybody can hear me. And I thank the organisers for inviting me to present to you today. It's a really lovely opportunity. I'd first also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the unceded lands from which I'm speaking today, the lands of the Woiwurrung Wurundjeri peoples of the East Kulin Nations, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. As the definition of what it means to be a migrant becomes ever more complex, so does the curatorial endeavour to present these diverse experiences through material culture. In terms of refugees, this has always been challenging. These tend to be people who bring little with them, and what they had, they often don't keep. These tend to be, I beg your pardon. At Museums Victoria, we have many examples of stories of people seeking refuge since World War II. But what of the people who have clear intent to seek refuge in Australia, but are prevented from doing so? Those who spend years in refugee camps applying for asylum in Australia without success. or those who spend months and years in onshore and offshore detention due to Australian policy, but are either deported or never even make it here. These absence stories are nevertheless Australian stories and offer amongst the greatest challenges of all to the acquisition of tangible collections. These people usually have little in terms of artefacts that they own or don't actually need. Their restricted and often remote geographical locations make the direct physical interaction we rely on to take receipt of material and record stories virtually impossible. And barriers to communication due to limited internet access can further heighten the degree of difficulty. However, social media platforms are providing a vital form of communication between museums and asylum seekers, including the vital role refugee advocates are playing in acting as trusted intermediaries on our behalf. This all raises ethical questions about how to enable refugees and asylum seekers to give voice to their own stories, how to safely share publicly the stories of vulnerable people, and how to obtain tangible representations of their experiences. And at this point, I wish to acknowledge Dr. Anh Nguyen at ACU, who has done a lot of work in this space and is currently contributing to collections research with me at the museum. So I would like to share the stories behind two recently acquired objects, which challenged our previous understanding of who an Australian migrant might be, the legitimacy of their stories in a collection of Australian migration narratives, and the role of creative practice in giving these stories tangible form. The first is this table centre, a bundle of bright red poppies created through the art of crochet. It is an artistic form which has traditionally been undervalued as a mainly pre- and post-World War II domestic female craft and categorised as such in museum collections. A discussion about gender and domestic material culture is for another day, but this object challenges our assumptions in even more complicated ways. This table centre was created by Aung Saw Lim, his family nickname Man Man, who was a refugee from Myanmar detained on Manus Island from 2013. Man Man learned the craft of crochet through a caseworker during his years of detention, and this caseworker supplied him with the yarn to work with. While on Manus, he developed his craft as a coping mechanism for life in detention, a distraction for endless hours of boredom and loneliness, and he gifted and shared his crafts with others, including refugee advocate Jill Paris. In 2017, Jill wrote in their co-authored self-published book, Man Man Making Meaning on Manus, that he found the rhythmic activity helped him relax, kept him occupied for hour upon endless hour, and used his innate skills with colour and form. Jill Paris started a friendship with Man Man on Facebook when she liked the landscape photographs he had posted. As well as crochet work, Man Man was also a photographer of everyday life on Manus. He uploaded pictures that documented the landscape and fauna of the island, the camp, his living quarters, belongings, including piles of yarn. After the three-way relationship between the museum, Man Man and Jill began, Man Man was able to pass a small selection of his crochet works to Michael Green, another asylum seeker advocate, to deliver to Jill, who then presented them with Man Man's permission to the museum to be acquired for the collection, along with a selection of his digital photographs. Man Man made the poppies in honour of Remembrance Day in 2017. He had heard about the 500 Poppies project, a community effort that started in Melbourne in 2013 to pay respect and remembrance for soldiers. A Facebook friend suggested that he crochet some poppies for the display in Canberra, which he did, but the work was unable to be delivered in time. This piece is a touching demonstration of Man Man's engagement with an Australian national public ritual, with which he had no direct connection, recreating a symbol of World War I remembrance of loss, grief and suffering, when his own and those of other asylum seekers goes not only unrecognised on the official record, but is perpetuated by officials of government. The image of Man Man patiently crocheting poppies, that potent symbol of loss, for a commemoration event in Australia that he could never attend, I find particularly moving and the essence of the power of objects. Man's creative output through crochet speaks to his generosity, and he gave many of his pieces away, the quickness of his ability to learn the craft, his enjoyment of colour and texture, and also his courage in undertaking a traditionally female art practice in a very male environment. He once reflected to Jill, I'm crochet and knitting here, and many men say that what I do is a lady's job, but I don't care what they say. I'm continuing because I know myself. Male, female, gay, lesbian, or transgender, this is my life. In 2018, Man was accepted for asylum in the United States as part of an intake of refugees from Manus, negotiated between the Australian and United States governments. He is now making a new start and trying to leave this period of his life behind him. So Man never reached Australian shores, and yet this is clearly an Australian migration story. It represents Australia's offshore detention policies and their management. It humanises and individualises a person, one of thousands who have been hidden by the wall of political and media dehumanisation. It gives voice and materiality to a person who desperately wanted to make a life here. And as an act of digital activism, these creative artefacts could only have been brought to light and a donation offer facilitated and achieved through the social media networks nurtured between Man, Jill and Michael. These friendships facilitated on Facebook between vastly different people in terms of age, gender, culture and life experiences demonstrate the role of social media in contemporary migration narratives in terms of how it provides global communication access for the diaspora living in displacement or detention. But it is also important to observe that these relationships played out in public also have their limitations. Man was also always careful to mostly provide a positive spin on his experiences and his reflections, with just occasional lapses into sadness and hopelessness. Facebook was not for him a safe space in terms of sharing honest and explicit information about his situation and about Australian government asylum seeker management policies and processes. His friend Jill was always clear that their exchanges focused on sharing their creative interests, keeping the tenor of their exchange benign and non-threatening, and certainly not an outlet for asylum seeker activism. So when relying on social media content to represent his story, the museum is only able to document a voice tempered by anxiety, self-protection, and a state of powerlessness. Man's story in his collection is also an example of a museum reliant on relationships of trust between the donor and their advocate, between the advocate and the museum, and ultimately the donor and the museum. The donation and all the related documentation and approvals were brokered by Jill, down to advice on Man's state of mind, needs and wishes, a form of community engagement on which the whole undertaking depended. Consequently, we are so fortunate as to have 4 crochet pieces created by Man, 20 digital photographs he produced of his life on Manus, and a tangible way to represent this crucial broader narrative through a real person with a name and a face. The second object is a pencil drawing which poignantly and painfully traces a young teenager's journey from Afghanistan to Indonesia. Drawing as therapy for traumatized children is common practice, but this drawing came with an artist's name, story, and consent, and was created by a teenage girl who never set foot on Australian soil. Zara Jafari was originally from Afghanistan, her family from the persecuted Hazara ethnic minority. They fled to Indonesia and began the long process of applying for refugee status and acceptance to Australia. Zara was a student in 2015 at Cisarua Refugee Learning Centre in Bogor, but the family then had to move to Jakarta, where they lived in a poor area and difficult conditions. At the school, Zara created this drawing in coloured pencil to portray the suffering of people in Afghanistan, the risks refugees are forced to take to find safety, and her own dreams of coming to Australia. Like Man, it is easy to visualise Zara sitting at a table, spilling her disturbing memories and her dreams onto this piece of paper. The donor of the drawing, John Taylor, was a tutor at the Dandenong Refugee Centre who visited Indonesia and the schools regularly. He noticed Zara's drawing on the school Facebook page, and he suggested on one of his visits that the drawing should reside in Melbourne's Immigration Museum. The school administrator and art teacher agreed. John met Zara and her family around 2018 and purchased the drawing from her during his second visit there. He believed that Zara should receive some payment for the exchange. Zara and the school hoped to one day see this drawing on display at the Immigration Museum. Zara stated in a Facebook post in 2017, "My painting represents the journey that I and my family took in search of a better life. From our horror situation in Afghanistan to the unknown transit in Indonesia, in the hope to live and be resettled in the beautiful country of Australia. My dream is to be a doctor and help people in need, even those without money. I wish to find a place that I can call home and meet my brother who lives in Australia. If there was no war in Afghanistan, I would never accept the label of refugee for my family and myself." Zara's drawing, her experiences as a refugee, and friendship on Facebook with donor John Taylor demonstrate again a historical shift in how social media is impacting international relationships and connections between Australians and people seeking asylum. Without this Facebook relationship and the brokering role played by the donor and the young artist, her parents and her school, this acquisition is unlikely to have occurred. Without social media, we would have been unable to add Zara's voice interpreting her own artwork. And as this detail from the drawing shows, it is heartbreaking in demonstrating the burden of suffering carried by children due to the violence of war and displacement. Much to Zara's delight, the drawing has been uploaded to the museum's collections website, giving a broader public profile for her story and placing it in a context of Australian migration stories that policy and circumstances have meant that for Zara, like Man, her story has diverted away from Australia and ended up in another country. Unusually, we've been able to follow Zara's story a little further. In 2021, her family was accepted by Canada through their humanitarian program. They are settling there, and Zara is receiving the education she dreamt of, but she cannot be reunited with her brother, whom she has not seen for 10 years. She wrote a piece so that her story narrative could be updated and provided this self-portrait at our request to enable us to finally put a face to her name and to her drawing. A bundle of crocheted poppies and a pencil drawing on paper, objects of creativity and self-expression, made only a couple of years apart. One object which literally outlines a refugee journey of fear, violence, and hope, drawn as a trauma therapy tool and an act of catharsis, a picture telling 1,000 words. The other object, which is an act of self-preservation, mental health maintenance, social connection, and friendship, an outlet for artistry through bright colours, the tactility of wool, and the production of the everyday and the utilitarian in circumstances that were anything but. The presence of the two makers is potent. They held the wool and crochet hook and the pencils and paper. They bent over the drawing and the poppies as they emerged, and they held and then passed over to others the work of their hands. These precious items provide an anchor point to giving names, faces, and voices to the real people who are caught up in the global refugee crisis affecting millions and the harsh reality of Australia's management of asylum seekers. And they also demonstrate how social media can facilitate human connections and plays a role in how the refugee diaspora living in displacement informs Australian public consciousness and activism. This includes enabling the museum to connect with asylum seekers whose statelessness challenges definitions of migrant and the stories and material culture collected for museum collections under this slipperiest of terms. Objects such as those of Man and Zara provide the museum with the opportunity to document the experiences of people who have wished to, but cannot become Australian citizens, and embrace them as part of Australia's darker and mostly invisible contemporary migration narrative. Thank you.
Maya, thank you so much for such a thoughtful and really incredibly moving paper. I can't thank you enough. You've given us so much to think about, and we're going to come back to this. So now let's move from Moya to Mary. I'd like to introduce Dr. Mary Tomsic, Research Fellow in the Research Centre for Refugees, Migration and Humanitarian Studies at the Australian Catholic University. Mary is a cultural historian whose research focuses on visual representations of child refugees, children's cultural expression and histories of migration, and how these circulate in the public realm. Mary's paper is titled Photo Album Woven Cover, Connecting Family, Documenting Work, and Depicting Displaced People in Germany after World War II. Thank you, Mary.
Thanks very much, Lorinda. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak with you today. I would also like to pay my respects to the Wurundjeri people on the unceded land from which I work and live. So today I'm going to primarily talk to you about one object. And actually, I feel like I'm kind of cheating slightly with this because the thing I want to talk about is composed of lots of objects. And that object is made up of what we might call other objects and contains different objects, which when they all come together becomes another object again. The order I talk about these, I think, does determine in some way how we might think about the object, material culture, and what history we can tell from it. So where to start and what can we learn about refugee objects and history from this multi-layered artefact? So lest this sound like I'm talking around and around in circles, I'll start with the title that this item has in Museum Victoria's collection, Photo Album Woven Cover. This is one layer of the object that we could note and the place that I'm going to start. I looked at this album initially a few years ago when I was beginning research into visual representations of child refugees. I was fortunate enough to be able to return to the museum recently and examine the album again. The cover is digitised and is now on Museum Victoria's website where it can be seen by many. And I think the value of having online digital versions of objects has really been brought home to us since the beginning of the pandemic. But there is also much about the materiality of the album that's not so readily conveyed with a digital image. I had forgotten how small the album is. It's 12 centimetres by 8 centimetres, so smaller than my phone, but much thicker because the pages bulk its depth. The cover is embroidered with a bright and striking geometrical pattern on thick fabric. The pattern covers the front, but not the back of the album. The album is bound together with cord and tassels, and there are metal eyelets that hold the cover and the pages together. There's an inscription on the inside cover that dates the use of the album to 1946. In many ways, I want to say more about the album itself, who made it and how, the skills involved and where the materials came from, but I don't know that much about that, and I think this would be hard to know. I can, however, speak about the creators of it in general terms, and this is part of what I was suggesting at the start about the different layers and histories that objects can tell, and that some of these layers are more elusive and difficult to know than others. The album was made by a person or people who were called DPs, which stands for displaced persons, who at the end of World War II were in Europe, but outside of their home country because of the war, and they could not return home. Art and craft works by DPs for exhibition and sale was an activity that many were involved in, and examples of what was created are now a feature of Museum Victoria's significant collection. I want to just tell you a little bit more background to the creation of this object. The United National Rehabilitation and Relief Administration, UNRWA, was established in 1943. Its mission was to provide economic assistance to European nations after World War II and to repatriate and assist the refugees who would come under Allied control. It ceased operation in 1947, and the International Refugee Organisation, the IRO, took on this work. The IRO was replaced by the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, the UNHCR, in 1952, and which is an ongoing organisation that's still doing a lot of work in this space today. But at the end of World War II, with UNRWA, and the development of it, we saw a new international and professionalised form of humanitarianism in action. At its peak in 1946, the year that this album is dated, UNRWA had 11,000 employees in Europe and almost 25,000 staff in total. As part of this work, people were housed in camps, DP camps, and in these camps, services were provided, and UNRWA and the IRO were responsible for managing these camps. Refugee camps themselves can be seen as part of a practice to regulate and control the movement of people, both locally and across the globe, in the past and in the present. And the objects and history which Moya spoke about, I think, are examples of the types of camps we see in operation today, examples of people's creative expression while seeking asylum. And I see this object as part of a bigger history of objects of people's lives in camps. I want to introduce you to a woman called Esma Banner now. She features in my abstract to this paper, but I wanted to talk about the album as an object first before focusing on Esma. Esma Banner was one of 39 Australians who worked for UNRWA in camps for DPs in Germany. She was initially employed in Australia in 1945 as a clerk typist, then deployed overseas in the US zone as a secretary, and then promoted to administrative assistant. After UNRWA closed, she worked for the IRO. In 1947, she took on the role of refugee employment specialist, and in 1950, she became a welfare officer. This map is from 1948 and has the various US zones that were established in Germany. Most of Banner's work were in areas 2, 5, and 7, which is the southwestern part of Germany, bordering Austria, Switzerland, and France. And I've just put a current map so you can see the surrounding countries. Banner resigned from her role in March 1951 to return to Australia to work in her family's haulage business and care for sick relatives. The bulk of Esma Banner's archive is held by Museum Victoria. There are some of her papers in the National Archives of Australia as well. Museum Victoria has more than 1,000 items, which include letters, diaries, craft work, and photographs. And it's some of the craft items that I've included on this slide because of their significance in documenting the activities of DPs. These craft objects are now held in our State Museum, and curators have worked to note these significant material traces of the past, to have them collected, preserved, and displayed. What I also want to highlight here is how significant it is to have a range of records available so that we can understand more about the specific objects and the meanings ascribed to them. With items created by people who are alive and actively donated, like the ones Moya spoke about, we can ask questions and possibly know more about them. But when this isn't the case, a range of different sources become really significant to interpret these historical objects. The art and craft created by DPs was highly valued by Banner. It was part of her paid work in her employment role, but it was also of personal and familial interest to her. Her sister, Marguerite Maloney, known as Madge, was a highly successful commercial artist, and Banner really valued this type of creativity. She purchased art and craft works. She sent some home to Australia, others she kept, and some were purchased by the IRO as well. There are many photo albums in Banner's collection, which are of particular arts and craft handicraft exhibitions in Germany. And I think these are really important records showing what people did in DP camps. It was a key way that nationalities and ethnicities were enacted and displayed in the aftermath of war. What we don't know directly from these objects is what making them meant for those living in the camps. I think this album, as a refugee object, is also significant because of the work that Esma Banner did in filling its pages and sending it on its journey across the world. Banner was an amateur photographer, and the practice of photography was very important to her. In a letter home to family, she said, "You are always in my thoughts. Every picture I take is for you." The inscription Banner wrote in this album also reflects the place of photographs in helping her to stay connected to her family in Australia. So it reads, "To Ivy, Here are a few of the snaps taken over the last year, sent to you with love and Christmas greetings, Xmas 1946. I won't go into detail about all the photographs in this album, but they're very small photographs, the size of stamps. And in this album, like others Banner made, she's captioned the photographs to help record information, but also explain them to those who are viewing them. So there's photos of where she's living, so some labelled my balcony, the pool, photographs of places she's visited, a bombed church in Munich, street scenes, and photographs showing weather conditions, some showing rain, others showing mist. There are also some photographs of cattle, some quite close up in a kind of a farming scene with cattle and a wagon and people. And these are not captioned about what's in them, but about the process of photography. So the caption reads, Anne Petrovich and I took these pictures nearby, and Anne was a colleague of Esma Banner's. There's portraits of people, there's lots of colleagues, many of those are named, and in this album and in lots of her others, there's lots of photographs of a dog called Carrick, as opposed to how groups of displaced people or DPs were photographed. They're often noted collectively as DPs. Now, I want to say a little bit more about two photographs in particular. So here is another layer of the objects within an object because of the way that Banner has photographed and framed people, and what this says, I think, for us, for what we can think about the histories that emerge from these items. So one photograph is captioned with the description DPs at Muldorf with Joyce Horner. It's a small photograph with a group of 5 small children and 4 adults formally posed. On the next page is a photograph that looks to have been taken at the same time and place, with approximately 25 people posing outside of a building, and the caption here is Children at Purton 1 Camp with Joyce Horner. What I want to suggest with these captions and the way the photographs were taken and cropped and pasted carefully into this album is this shows us what Banner wanted her sister and family to see. She did want them to share these representations of displaced people and children and adults who are really part of this picture of post-war reconstruction, but it's Joyce Horner in particular she wants her family to know about. Joyce Horner was a New Zealand nurse who featured in Banner's correspondence home. She wrote a short article about her for the Australian Women's Weekly, and also in other photos that Banner took of Horner, but also quite a few other women who were working with UNRWA and the IRO. Banner described Joyce Horner as very earnest and probably the best nurse in our district. She's an expert with children. So this connection to the value and the importance Banner placed on her work and the work of other women is really significant in this collection and in this album. And it's here in the album and in Banner's writings and photographs and papers more broadly that there is much evidence of the work she did with refugees and the work that her female colleagues did as well. And they were women whose skills she really valued and admired. So photo albums are social objects. They're created to be shared, and Banner used and created physical albums a lot to document her life and to keep in touch with her family. Album creation in this way is not a practice that is carried out exactly in the same way. We share photographs, but in different ways. The album itself and some of the photographs inside the covers provide us with glimpses of what displaced people were doing, what refugees were doing, what activities they arranged and how they carried them out. And this includes the art and craft objects that they made, which are now housed in Museum Victoria. The importance of work for Banner was clear. In her correspondence, when she's trying to decide whether to come home or Australia or not, when her father is unwell, she said, I would like to stay here for 9 or 12 months. As the job has become very intense, and I feel I'm at the stage of really learning something. Banner herself was supportive of immigration. In October in 1946, in a letter home, she said, Australia would benefit from an influx of varied people, but of course everyone is so afraid of losing something by letting others in. And it's this photo of Banner that I want to end with. It might be a little bit hard to see, but she's holding her camera on her lap. And I think it is really Banner's dual interest in photography and work that we can see most clearly in this refugee object of a photo album I've spoken about today. In it, we have part of a personal and professional picture of one woman's working life in post-war reconstruction and her interest in photography. And alongside this, we have some access to the traces of DP's lives at the end of World War II. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. I found that absolutely fascinating, and I know our audience will have as well. Before we open up for questions from the audience, though, I'm interested in the similarities and differences in your approaches to working with objects. Moya as a curator and Mary, you as a historian. Moya, I wondered if you had a question or a reflection for Mary about her work with the photo album. And then I'd love to ask Mary if I could encourage you to respond to Moya's paper, perhaps with a question or a comment about what struck you most about her work with material culture.
So Lorinda, sorry, can you just clarify what you would like me to respond to?
Yeah, I wondered whether you might have a question for Mary about her work with the album, or something that struck you as being a really interesting aspect of what she's looking at.
Well, as Mary knows, I'm very familiar with this object and this collection, having worked on it for a while and with some wonderful student researchers who've done a lot of work on this project. I think I feel very appreciative that it's such an important collection, has had the attention that it's had from researchers like Mary, who've really brought out some of these, these really interesting things about what objects can tell us. And I think that issue around absence again comes out with this particular object, because it's, while the story is very much about Esma Banner and her working life and her incredible achievements from where she was, that she collected these craft items as sort of souvenirs of her time. These objects were being made in displaced people's camps for display and even for sale. And I think Mary's point to the fact that we can't really know the makers is an interesting one. It's quite a poignant one. They are broadly symbolic of the thousands of displaced people that came to Australia via those camps. And we do actually in the museum have some material, some craft objects made by people that we know who they are, and we can tell that story. So these objects have been carried by someone else and become a more of a symbol of that kind of that creativity. So it's an interesting little tension there, I suppose, about whose story gets told, that the focus is very much about Esma, and that's very appropriate, but who are the unknown people, often women, not always, but often women who make these items, who we can never really put a face to or know. Yeah, so I think that's a really important point to make.
Wayne, thank you so much. Mary, I wondered, did you have anything to say about Moya's paper?
Oh yeah, thanks, Lorinda. I think Moya, the point about absences is really significant and something that we all have to sit with and work out what our take and approach is. But I was particularly interested in the way you described the networks that were enlisted to acquire those particular objects. And I think often social media is sometimes seen as vacuous and, loops going nowhere. But I think your two examples are really significant to show the value that this technological change has had. And I didn't know whether you had any reflections on, changing practices of acquiring refugee objects because of social media, or different new forms of connection we have today.
Well, I guess certainly in my practice it has revolutionized it a little. It's an interesting question, isn't it? Because without so it required that brokerage or facilitation on the museums or on the museum's behalf to connect with these people and to build those extremely important relationships of trust, which I would say too is hard because as curators we're so used to the direct connection with our donors and our storytellers. So it's a bit challenging to have there's something a bit in between, that there's that kind of intermediary. It's not something we're often used to. Although that having said, like with Zara, I have actually had direct communication with her. I've been able to follow up her story and find out that they got to Canada and get her to write a piece to sort of help us bookend that story. But so that's been lovely. And Man, I had a little bit of email exchange with him, but it was very much reliant on those third parties, and being able in a way to entrust, for the museum to entrust ourselves in their hands, because we want to do the best thing by those vulnerable people, and to be sharing their stories and giving them a platform to share their stories in an empowering way, and to make sure that those relationships are as reciprocal as possible. There's a power dynamic there that is could be tricky, and so it's always about, trust is such a significant thing. So so social media has been a really interesting different sort of form of communication and engagement, but it's something I think we always need to be watchful about in how all of us in these 3-4-way kind of relationships kind of interact, and make sure that the person at the center of the story is cared for and empowered, and treated inappropriately, if that makes sense. Yeah.
I'm enjoying this conversation so much, and I'd love to open it up to our audience now to join us as well. So if you have a question, please do type it into our question and answer tab. We have a question waiting here. Mary, you finished your presentation with that wonderful photo of Banner with her camera on her lap. And one of our audience members wonders why you didn't show photographs inside the album. I know you spoke about them in a really beautiful way. Why not show us some of them?
Well, so none of the photos from within the album are available online, and Moya, you might be able to help with, I guess that's also interesting around questions around permission for use of images and reuse of images. And so some of the photos in the National Archive collection I have taken photographs of, and there has been permission given. But yeah, the question, and I think there's something interesting as well. So there's sort of those institutional questions, but then one of my colleagues, historian Jordana Silverstein, has written about, when you are working in an archive and working with materials that it's unlikely people ever imagined that you as a historian were going to be looking at them in an archive very far away from where they were living. What are the ethical responsibilities and questions around that? And I do end up writing about those photos and describing them, but I wonder if showing them is something that we should or shouldn't do. And that so there's sort of those two layers of what's allowed, and then also what are the ethical questions around it.
Yeah, that's such a fabulous response, Mary. Thank you so much. We have another question that's come through. So both the objects that you've both spoken about, they're embedded with so much emotion through the stories that they carry. So how do you think we can convey this depth of emotion in a museum environment?
In a museum environment, presumably the questioner is talking about on the floor, in an exhibition in the museum rather than in the collection store.
Yeah.
Yes, always super challenging. I think certainly at the Immigration Museum and lots of museums, we are working harder and harder to make sure that we are enabling first-person voice as much as possible. There's more standing back from that museum or curatorial voice to enable people to speak for themselves. And I think even just from those quotes, at least from my presentation, when we have those moments of first-person voice, like from Man and from Zara, just lifts the object to another level, so that it becomes something more than a curator is speaking around, but what the person is actually, the maker or the creator is actually speaking to that object and giving it the voice. So in terms of that kind of authenticity of emotion, the best way to do that is through the person's own voice. So if I am in a position to display, one day those objects will be displayed for sure. In fact, another one of Man's work is going on display soon at the Immigration Museum with a little bit of Histories. So the best way to do it is through that personal voice. Obviously, ideally, if you have recordings of being able to hear the nuances of the personal voice. We don't have that opportunity in this case. That can evolve that further when you've got video, that then you can see someone and see the emotion as they're speaking. So it's really just how to bring that, as I say, that authenticity of the personal voice to the object and bring that into our exhibitions where we can.
Well, thank you so much. Another question, what do you think that objects offer to the kinds of stories that you're telling, the kinds of histories that you're writing, that things like written documents may not? What makes objects so critically important to your work? And I know that objects do inform so much of what you both do.
I'll let you go, Mary.
Oh, thanks, Moya. Yeah, there's something about, and I was really struck again by returning to that album recently, and particularly I think in the context of the last couple of years of work being mostly with digital and online, that there's knowing that thing that you're working with has had a life of its own and been particular places. It almost takes on some sort of hallowed status, which I feel a little bit silly saying, but it's just that knowing that where it has been, and you'll never know all the ins and outs of it. And I think, look, particularly something like a photo album, it really does bring home a sense of scale and physicality that's often not so much part of the digital. So thinking about photo albums, and when photos were more in printed forms and sent in letters and passed on, that that there's a whole picture you can build up about the social event, sometimes that you'll never know in that much detail, but a letter came to a family and it was shared amongst people. So people are sitting around, are they having a cup of tea, what's going on? I think it really does help to remind you of the social context and also the limits of what we kind of know might have happened, or what we know really did happen, which I think in the practice of history writing is really significant, the distinction between the generalized things and then the very specific things that we do have evidence for.
Fantastic. I'm conscious that we're nearing the end of our hour, or our 50 minutes, excuse me. So I think it's time for us to close, but I'd like to really warmly thank Moya and Mary for their really terrific papers. I enjoyed them so much, and I know I'm going to be thinking about these objects long after we leave today. I'd also like to thank the team behind the Material Histories seminar series, those at the Old Treasury Building and the Australian Catholic University, for all the work that's gone into launching the program today. Our next seminar is Material Histories, Unpicking Fashionable Objects, which will be held on the 10th of March next year. And if this seminar has captured your interest, I'd like to direct your attention to the next Making Public Histories seminar, which is on refugee stories. This will be held on Thursday, the 24th of November at 5 p.m. So please let me thank you all again for your attendance, for your interest and for your participation. We've greatly enjoyed having you with us. A reminder that we welcome proposals for future seminars, so please see the Material Histories page on the Old Treasury Building website for more information on this. Thank you again and enjoy your afternoon.